The mountains were shrouded in a heavy silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Jack sat in his worn armchair, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting warm shadows on the walls of his cabin. He had grown used to the solitude of his remote home, nestled deep in the heart of the wilderness. The outside world felt like a distant memory, and the creatures of the forest were his only company. He had spent years as a wildlife photographer, capturing fleeting moments of beauty in the natural world. But tonight was different. There was a strange stillness to the air, a tension that hung over the landscape, warning of the storm that was about to hit. As the wind began to howl and the first snowflakes began to fall, Jack settled deeper into his chair, pulling his blanket tighter around his shoulders. He knew this storm would be like any other, fierce but brief. But as the minutes passed, a nagging feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. Something felt off. He tried to shake off the unease, but it only grew stronger. Then, there it was. A sound, a faint thump, barely audible over the wind. Jack froze, his senses sharpening. He strained his ears, listening. Another thump, this time louder. It was coming from the door. His heart raced, but curiosity drove him to his feet. He moved cautiously toward the door, unsure of what to expect. Maybe it was a deer or some other creature seeking shelter from the storm. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to seek refuge near human homes during severe weather, but this felt different. The sound was too deliberate, too persistent. As he opened the door, he was greeted by a scene that took his breath away. Standing at the threshold of his cabin was a large bobcat, its fur dusted with snow. The wild animal was clearly exhausted, its breathing shallow and labored, but there was something in its eyes that stopped Jack in his tracks. The bobcat's golden gaze locked with his, full of intelligence and desperation. Behind her, two tiny cubs huddled close, barely visible in the blizzard's fury. They were shaking, cold, and vulnerable. For a moment Jack hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He had seen wild animals up close many times, but this felt different. This was no ordinary encounter. The bobcat's stare wasn't one of fear or aggression, but one of quiet trust, as if she knew she could rely on him. Jack's heart softened as he realized the gravity of the situation. The storm was raging outside, and there was no way for this family to survive in the wilderness tonight. Without thinking, Jack stepped back, opening the door wider to allow them entry. The bobcat paused, eyeing him warily, before she slowly padded inside, followed by her cubs. The wind howled outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire offered a sanctuary of safety. Jack closed the door gently behind them, feeling the weight of what he had just done. He had invited a wild family into his home, an action that could have unpredictable consequences, but something inside him knew it was the right choice. The bobcat moved cautiously across the room, her eyes never leaving Jack as she settled near the fireplace, curling up protectively around her cubs. They were tiny, barely a few weeks old, their eyes still closed, their fur soft and fragile. Jack watched them, his mind racing. He had no idea how long they had been out in the storm, but it was clear they had been struggling. He quickly set about gathering food, unsure of what the bobcat would eat, but hoping something would be acceptable. As he placed the meat on the floor near her, she sniffed it cautiously, then began to eat with controlled urgency. Jack watched in silence, the room filled with the soft sounds of chewing and the occasional crackle from the fire. His mind raced as he tried to process the situation. How long would they stay? Would the mother stay calm, or would she grow restless with their proximity? He knew the bobcat was wild, that her instincts were untamable, but for now she seemed to accept his presence. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but Jack couldn't help but feel that this moment, this strange, unexpected turn of events, would change everything. He had opened his door to the unknown, and now there was no going back. The next morning, the storm showed no signs of abating. The snow had piled high against the cabin walls, and Jack could barely make out the outline of the forest beyond the window. The world outside was a blinding blur of white, the trees barely visible beneath the thick layer of snow. Inside, the bobcat family had settled into their new temporary home. Sarah, the mother, lay curled protectively around her cubs, their small bodies tucked into the warmth of the blankets Jack had hastily spread across the floor. Jack had expected the bobcat to be wary, perhaps aggressive, but instead she had been surprisingly calm. There was an unmistakable wariness in her eyes, though, a reminder that she was still very much a wild animal. She observed Jack carefully, as if weighing his every movement, but her body language was relaxed, the tension in her muscles slowly easing as the warmth from the fire filled the room. Her cubs, too, seemed to find comfort in their new surroundings. They huddled close to their mother, their tiny bodies moving in time with her steady breathing, their fur still too soft and delicate to be exposed to the harsh cold outside. Jack didn't want to intrude on their fragile peace, but he knew he couldn't ignore the situation forever. He had offered them shelter, but now he had to think about what came next. He couldn't keep the bobcat family indoors indefinitely. It wasn't safe for them, and it wasn't fair to Sarah. The storm had trapped them here, but eventually the snow would melt, and they would need to return to the wild where they truly belonged. As the hours passed, Jack spent time in his study, trying to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the bobcat family in the next room. He'd always been captivated by wildlife, fascinated by the strength and beauty of the creatures he had spent so many years documenting. But this was different. This was personal. He found himself checking on them more than once, observing how Sarah would carefully groom her cubs, licking their fur in long, rhythmic strokes. Her eyes never left them, always alert, always watching for any signs of danger. It was a natural instinct, one that Jack admired deeply. Meanwhile, the cubs were beginning to stir, showing signs of growing strength. They were still wobbly on their legs, but they would occasionally crawl a short distance before tumbling back onto the soft blankets. Their movements were awkward and clumsy, but Jack could see the spark of curiosity in their eyes. He couldn't help but smile as they struggled to climb over each other, playfully swatting at their mother's tail or trying to explore the edge of the room. Sarah allowed them the freedom to explore, but she always kept a close watch, ready to intervene if they ventured too far. Over the next few days, a routine began to take shape. Jack continued to provide food and fresh water, making sure to maintain a respectful distance. He had learned not to get too close to Sarah, respecting her space and not pushing her to trust him more than she already had. The cubs, on the other hand, seemed more comfortable with him, curious about the strange human who had opened his door to them. They would watch him from across the room, their golden eyes following his every move, but they never came too close, always staying near their mother for safety. As time passed, Jack couldn't help but notice the changes in Sarah. Her limp, which had been so pronounced when she first arrived, seemed to be improving. She moved more freely now, no longer favoring her injured leg as she once had. Jack had no way of knowing for sure, but he suspected that the rest and warmth had given her body the time it needed to heal. It was a small victory, one that made Jack feel a sense of pride. He had given this family a chance to recover, to survive in a world that could be so unforgiving. The cubs were growing rapidly, their once soft fur beginning to thicken and take on the signature spots of a bobcat. They were more agile now, and their playful antics had become a regular part of Jack's day. He had brought his camera into the living room, carefully setting up shots to document their development. Every moment was precious, a fleeting glimpse into a world that most people would never see. But he also knew that no matter how attached he became to them, their time in his home was limited. The storm had given them shelter, but nature would eventually call them back to the wild. Jack had to be ready for that. He could feel the weight of the responsibility growing heavier each day, but he knew that whatever happened, he had given them the best chance he could. And that was all anyone could do. The storm raged on, and as it did, Jack became increasingly absorbed in the lives of his unusual house guests. He had never expected his days to be filled with such unexpected companionship. He had always loved nature and wildlife, but this was something entirely different. Sarah and her cubs were not just animals passing through. They were part of his life now, and he couldn't help but marvel at their quiet beauty, their resilience, and the tender way Sarah cared for her young ones. Days blurred into one another, with the snow piling up outside and the cabin growing cozier as the storm continued. Sarah's limp had improved with rest, though Jack could still see signs of her struggle whenever she moved too quickly. Despite this, she was a dedicated mother, her eyes always scanning the room for potential dangers, always on guard for any sign of movement that could threaten her cubs. The cubs, meanwhile, were growing rapidly. The smallest one, a ball of fluff with a white ear, was always the most adventurous. Jack often caught him exploring the room, his tiny paws carefully navigating the unfamiliar space, his eyes wide with curiosity. The other cub, Bandit, was more cautious, sticking close to his mother and staying in the safety of the blankets. It was clear that Sarah was teaching her cubs more than just survival skills. She was teaching them the art of patience and observation. Jack had begun to notice how the cubs would carefully study their surroundings, watching their mother intently before they ventured out to explore. Sarah, on the other hand, would watch her cubs with a calm, attentive gaze, only intervening when they got too close to Jack or attempted to climb the furniture. She was teaching them the delicate balance of trust and caution, and Jack could see that they were learning quickly. Over the course of the next few days, Jack continued to document the Bobcat's development, taking countless photographs of their playful antics and tender moments. He captured images of Patch, the adventurous cub, climbing higher on the blankets and furniture, and Bandit, more timid, cautiously following his siblings' lead. He caught moments of Sarah watching over her family, her golden eyes filled with wisdom and determination. It was a privilege to witness their daily lives, to observe the quiet bond between mother and cubs. But the reality of the situation began to weigh on Jack's mind. He knew that as much as he had grown attached to them, this arrangement couldn't last forever. Eventually the snow would melt, the roads would clear, and the Bobcat family would need to return to the wild. Jack tried not to dwell on the inevitable, but the thought of the empty house that would follow their departure filled him with sadness. He had become so accustomed to their presence, the soft sounds of the cubs' play fighting, the gentle chirping of Sarah as she called them to nurse, the sight of them curled up together by the fire. It was the first time in years that Jack had felt a sense of family again. One afternoon, Jack was sitting in his chair, his gaze fixed on the Bobcats as they settled into their usual spots by the fire. His mind wandered back to the day Sarah had first appeared at his door, weak and injured, with her cubs in tow. He had been startled at first, unsure of what to do. But now, as he watched the family in front of him, he couldn't imagine his life without them. He thought about his late wife, Sarah, and how much he missed her. The quiet moments, the shared glances, the sense of belonging they had once had. But now, in the presence of Sarah and her cubs, he had found something unexpected, something that made him feel needed again, something that reminded him that family could come in many forms. As the storm continued to howl outside, Jack found himself torn between the desire to keep the Bobcats close and the knowledge that they needed to return to the wild. He couldn't keep them here forever, no matter how much he wanted to. It wasn't right. They were wild animals, and the forest was where they belonged. Still, he wasn't sure he was ready to say goodbye. He had never imagined that something as simple as opening his door to a mother bobcat would lead to such a profound change in his life. For now, all Jack could do was make the most of the time they had left together, continuing to document their growth and their moments of tenderness. He watched as Sarah's motherly instincts guided her cubs as they learned to navigate their new world, just as he was learning to navigate this new chapter in his own life. The days passed in a peaceful rhythm, each one filled with a new milestone, a new discovery, a new bond between them. And Jack, though he knew the time to release them into the wild was coming, couldn't help but cherish every moment he had left with his extraordinary house guests. The days began to lengthen as spring approached, and the atmosphere in Jack's home shifted subtly. The snow had finally started to melt, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the white blanket. The once quiet house now felt even more alive with the sounds of the bobcats growing stronger. Sarah had become less cautious, moving with more ease, and her cubs, now almost fully grown, were more energetic and mischievous than ever before. They were no longer the small, fragile creatures they had been when they arrived. They were becoming wild in every sense of the word, testing their strength, climbing higher, and even pouncing on imaginary prey. Jack spent his days observing them, capturing each new skill they mastered. Patch, the more adventurous of the two, was already testing the limits of the outdoor enclosure Elena had helped him design. He would leap from one platform to another, his movements more fluid with each jump, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Bandit, on the other hand, had become more confident, though still a bit more reserved. He would follow his sibling, copying his actions, sometimes hesitating before making the leap. But Jack could see the change in him, the growing courage. Every evening after the cubs had exhausted themselves with play, Sarah would call them back to the warmth of the house, where they would curl up together, their soft breathing filling the room. It was a routine now, one that Jack had grown accustomed to. He watched them, fascinated by their transformation. There was something almost magical about seeing the cubs grow from tiny, helpless creatures to bold, playful young bobcats. Jack felt proud of them, as though he had a hand in their development, though he knew it was Sarah's instincts that had shaped them. The reality of their eventual release still weighed heavily on Jack's heart, though. He knew it was the right thing to do, but it was hard to let go. He had grown so attached to them, especially to Sarah. She had brought a sense of life back into his home, a sense of purpose he had not realized he had lost. Watching them become more self-sufficient and capable reminded him of the fleeting nature of life and how things change even when you least expect it. The cubs were nearly ready. Their eyes were bright, and their movements were quick and precise, just like their mother's. Jack could see that the time for their return to the wild was drawing near, but he wasn't sure he was ready for that goodbye. One morning, Elena arrived again, bringing with her the final pieces of the puzzle. The outdoor enclosure was complete, and the cubs had spent the last few days adjusting to it. They had learned to climb, to leap, and to hide in the natural dens Jack had built for them. They were ready for the next step. Elena suggested they start preparing for their eventual release into the wild, a process that Jack knew would take some time. They would need to become accustomed to being outside more often, to experiencing the sights, sounds, and smells of the world beyond Jack's door. Jack and Elena began planning the transition carefully. They set up feeding stations outside, preparing the land with fresh water and plenty of natural prey to ensure that the bobcats could find food once they were fully released. Elena worked with Jack to create a space where the cubs could learn to hunt, teaching them how to track and stalk prey, to test their instincts in the wild. Sarah watched, her protective gaze never leaving her cubs, but she seemed to trust Jack's judgment, as if she understood that this was the next chapter in their lives. As the days passed, Jack began to feel a bittersweet sense of inevitability. The cubs were growing stronger, more independent, and it was clear that the time was near. Sarah's eyes would often meet Jack's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She had trusted him, and he had done his best to care for her and her cubs. But Jack knew that they belonged to the wild, and it was time for them to reclaim their place there. Even as the cubs learned the ways of the wild, Jack couldn't help but wonder if they would remember him. Would they ever come back? Would they think of him as a friend, as the one who had opened his door and given them refuge in their time of need? He didn't know, but he had learned something important over the past few months. He had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give is the freedom to be who you truly are, to return to the world that is your birthright. As the sun began to set one evening, casting a golden glow across the mountains, Jack sat on his porch, his heart heavy but full of gratitude. He knew that soon the Bobcats would leave. But in the meantime, he had the privilege of watching them grow, of witnessing their transformation from fragile creatures to strong, independent beings ready to face the world on their own. It was a gift he would never forget. And as he watched Sarah and her cubs disappear into the trees one last time, he realized that his life had been touched in a way he had never imagined. It had been a quiet, unexpected adventure, one that had reminded him of the power of trust, the beauty of the wild, and the deep bond that can exist between a human and an animal, even if just for a moment. As the days grew warmer and the last of the snow melted away, Jack found himself reflecting on the changes that had taken place in his life. The house was quieter now. There were no more soft rustlings from the bobcats in the corners, no more playful growls or the distant chirping calls of the cubs. At times, Jack would find himself listening for those sounds, hoping for a sign that they hadn't truly left. But each time, the silence would settle over him, and he would remember that they were out there, in the wild where they truly belonged. The transition was not without its challenges, but it had been necessary. Jack knew this deep down. The wild was no place for domesticated life. The bobcats needed to hunt, to roam, to live according to their instincts. They had already shown so much promise, and Jack was proud of what he had been able to provide for them. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered in the space they once occupied. His home, though full of memories, now seemed too quiet. As he sat in the living room one afternoon, looking over the photographs he had taken during the months they had spent together, a strange sense of pride filled him. His camera had captured more than just pictures. It had captured the essence of their story, the bond that had formed between them, and the journey they had gone through together. He had documented each milestone, the first time the cubs took their tentative steps, the way Sarah had protected them and taught them, the way they all adapted to the rhythms of his home. These moments would stay with him forever, frozen in time, reminders of a brief yet profound connection with the wild. But there was something else, too, something deeper. Jack had realized that during their time together, he had been healing in ways he hadn't anticipated. When the bobcats arrived on his doorstep, they were broken, desperate for shelter, for safety, but over time they had thrived, and in helping them, Jack had unknowingly started to heal himself. His grief over his wife had been consuming, leaving him hollow and unsure of how to move forward. But the presence of the bobcats had brought him a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was needed again. He had cared for them, watched them grow stronger, and in turn, it had helped him rediscover a sense of strength within himself. Now, as he looked out over the landscape, He wondered if they were still out there. He imagined them, Sarah leading her cubs through the underbrush, teaching them how to hunt, how to survive. He hoped they were thriving, just as they had done in the safety of his home. And yet, a part of him held on to the hope that perhaps one day they might return. Maybe not to stay, but to show him that they remembered him, just as he would always remember them. The months passed, and Jack continued with his photography, capturing the beauty of the mountains, the wildlife that flourished in the valleys below. He would occasionally catch glimpses of bobcats in the distance, fleeting shadows moving silently through the trees. But none were Sarah or her cubs. Yet each time he saw one, he felt a sense of connection, as if they were still a part of his life in some small way. One evening, as Jack sat in the same chair where he had spent so many nights watching the bobcats, he received a call from Elena. They had been working together on a paper documenting the unusual event, the temporary adoption of wild bobcats into a human home. The journal had accepted their submission, and the article would be published soon. It was an unexpected honor, but Jack felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that their story, his story with the bobcats, could help others understand the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. He knew that by sharing this experience he could perhaps inspire more people to be compassionate, to open their hearts to the wild in the same way he had. As the year went on, Jack's heart slowly began to heal, though the ache of their absence never fully faded. He learned to embrace the quiet moments, the stillness of the house, and found solace in the photographs that lined his walls. The bobcats had left their mark on his life, and though they were gone, they had given him more than just memories. They had given him a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life had a way of surprising him. Their journey had been a story of survival, trust, and an unspoken bond that transcended the barriers between species. Every now and then Jack would leave the dog door unlocked just in case. He knew it was unlikely, but the gesture felt right. In his heart, he believed that if they ever needed him again, he would be there, ready to offer his help. The bobcats had shown him what it meant to be a part of something larger than himself, to offer a gift of trust without expecting anything in return. And for that, he would be forever grateful. Though he never saw Sarah and her cubs again, Jack continued to feel their presence in the quiet moments of his life. And when he looked out over the mountains, he would smile to himself, knowing that the wild was out there, still thriving, still full of life. And somewhere, perhaps, his bobcat family was too. Hunt. How to survive. He hoped they were thriving, just as they had done in the safety of his home. And yet, a part of him held on to the hope that perhaps one day they might return. Maybe not to stay, but to show him that they remembered him, just as he would always remember them. The months passed, and Jack continued with his photography, capturing the beauty of the mountains, the wildlife that flourished in the valleys below. He would occasionally catch glimpses of bobcats in the distance, fleeting shadows moving silently through the trees. But none were Sarah or her cubs. Yet each time he saw one, he felt a sense of connection, as if they were still a part of his life in some small way. One evening, as Jack sat in the same chair where he had spent so many nights watching the Bobcats, he received a call from Elena. They had been working together on a paper documenting the unusual event, the temporary adoption of wild bobcats into a human home. The journal had accepted their submission, and the article would be published soon. It was an unexpected honor, but Jack felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that their story, his story with the bobcats, could help others understand the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. He knew that by sharing this experience, he could perhaps inspire more people to be compassionate, to open their hearts to the wild in the same way he had. As the year went on, Jack's heart slowly began to heal, though the ache of their absence never fully faded. He learned to embrace the quiet moments, the stillness of the house, and found solace in the photographs that lined his walls. The Bobcats had left their mark on his life, and though they were gone, they had given him more than just memories. They had given him a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life had a way of surprising him. Their journey had been a story of survival, trust, and an unspoken bond that transcended the barriers between species. Every now and then Jack would leave the dog door unlocked, just in case. He knew it was unlikely, but the gesture felt right. In his heart, he believed that if they ever needed him again, he would be there, ready to offer his help. The Bobcats had shown him what it meant to be a part of something larger than himself, to offer a gift of trust without expecting anything in return. And for that, he would be forever grateful.